I want to begin by thanking you all for coming out tonight to hear my story. I'm grateful that you would take time out of your busy lives to come hear me speak. I want to thank the CEO organization for thinking of me and inviting me to do this. And I especially want to thank Deacon Bill Beaver, who acted as my editor. When I sat down to write this, it was kind of a life review, and the words just poured out on the page, and when I got done, there were 28 pages, single-spaced. So if not for Deacon Bill, you guys would have been here for 5 hours this evening. So with that, we'll begin. So the beginning. We begin in 1994. As a 14-year-old kid, I started looking to rock stars as idols. One of these idols in particular, and I use idol in the theological sense, was the rock star Jim Morrison of the 60s band, The Doors. Unbeknownst to me, Morrison had extremely pagan and even demonic influences in his life. I would start drinking, listening to openly satanic music, and evil would infiltrate my life in that way. So I determined that I wanted to be a rock star at the tender age of 14, and I would follow the paradigm. Section 2, My Peach Tree. Augustine relates in the Confessions that one night, he and a band of hoodlums climbed a fence and stole some peaches from a wealthy neighbor. As he puts it, alone I would not have committed that crime, in which my pleasure lay not in what I was stealing, but in the act of theft. But had I been alone, it would have given me absolutely no pleasure, nor would I have committed it. Friendship can be a dangerous enemy, a seduction of the mind lying beyond the reach of investigation. Idolizing a rock star and watching movies like Casino and Goodfellas, where the guys who were the virtuosos were the powerful, my band of hoodlums and I began to sneak out of the house seeking thrills. We would sneak out at night, smoke cigarettes, vandalize, and even car hop. My experience was exactly like Augustine's. One night that year, at 14 years old, I was invited to a friend's overnight birthday party. We had banded together to say we were going to drink, and it was the assignment of everyone that was going to steal some form of liquor from their parents for their own consumption. That night at the party, I guzzled down 2 beers I had stolen from my dad as fast as I could and found a pleasure I was to be enslaved to for the next 12 years of my life. I saw a mysticism in debilitating my reason the way Jim Morrison did. For me, losing control of reason was a form of getting in touch with the unknown and of touching God. That same year, I was introduced to marijuana for the first time. Getting involved with this drug culture, though, exposed me to evil, and I didn't realize I was opening a door. I first got my hands on pornography at this tender age as well, and was hooked in its throes before I had even made it through puberty. I began drinking frequently my sophomore year and was a full-blown alcoholic by the time I was a senior. My sophomore and junior years, I became so openly defiant at school that I received an in-school suspension, multiple detentions, and I was failing out of school. My father, upset over my failing grades, took me to all the military recruiters in the area. He told me, "You're failing in school, you don't have to go to college, but living like this, you won't be living in my house after you graduate." Tough love is a good thing. I got the message. It was my senior year of high school where the Savior, Jesus Christ, landed upon the beach of my soul under the cover of night, incognito. My mother was deeply involved with the pro-life movement at the time, and she brought my sister, my cousin, and I along for the March for Life. There I stood amongst 250,000 other souls protesting real tyranny. The rebellion I had in my soul for this ethereal man, the structure of society or the system, was intangible and unintelligible. It was something of an invention of my mind perpetuated by a fake mainstream secularist culture. But here, babies being murdered in the womb, I discovered the real tyranny, or what I wanted to rebel against. Here I met suffering post-abortive women, godly men and women, who all were fighting against a real injustice, the murder of innocents. As I marched along, I began to believe what these people believed. I understood the goodness of their cause, and I began to understand the lie that was abortion. I began to understand that our secular socialist media had lied to me about these people. They were not haters. They were not bigots. They were not anti-woman. Indeed, they were the exact opposite of these things. They were lovers. They were compassionate. They were pro-woman. And importantly, they were Catholic. This experience impacted me so much that I wrote my senior thesis on the lies of the population bomb of Paul Ehrlich and shot holes in the theories of Robert Malthus. Now, the quest for truth was only in its infancy in my life, but looking back, the pro-life movement was the principle that would lead me back to the church. College only deepened the alcoholic spiral. I could drink many nights a week with no repercussions. I would literally get blackout drunk and only have fading memories of entire nights. My mom had handed me a Bible before college with a note scripted on the inside cover that said, "All the answers that you will ever need will be found inside this book." I was far from God, getting blackout drunk multiple nights per week, unable to get out of bed for entire days because I had poisoned myself the night before, and behaving extremely weirdly while drinking. In fact, I was behaving in a mortally wicked way. So my freshman year of college, after living the lives of alcoholism, drug use, and satanic music for quite some time, I had a horrifying dream. My mortal sins had caught up with me. In the dream, I found myself floating supine in a dimly lit red room. I was in the air in a cruciform way. Unable to move, I heard this guttural voice say, "You are now mine." The dream I had would become a recurring theme throughout my reversion. Over and over, I would find myself dreaming of fighting a demon, holding a cross in hand. Usually I would be alone in a basement and I'd see traces or shadows, then the guttural voice would attack me. I would hold the cross and incant prayers of intercession from Jesus. They were truly horrifying dreams. I would wake up in a pool of sweat and scared of my own physical location. I'd actually question myself, is this thing here? So at the time I was a deist in belief, an atheist in practice, and a Catholic in the way I worshiped. I still tried to attend Mass occasionally, of course eating and drinking the blood of the Lord in an unworthy manner, and so becoming answerable for the body and blood of the Lord, as St. Paul tells us in Corinthians. But I had poor catechesis and didn't know that I was only adding sin to sin by sacrilegiously receiving our Lord, as I was not in communion with His church. After this horrifying dream, I decided to attend Mass in case there was any reality to the dream. When I went to Mass, I had a massive panic attack. So much so that I couldn't even stay, as I thought I was having a heart attack. I actually ended up going to the doctor to find out that there was nothing wrong with me. I left and told God that if He wanted me back, He'd have to cure me of this. Unbeknownst to me, I was starting to have an aversion to the Eucharist. Mortal sin had taken hold. It was not a rational aversion, as I didn't consciously think of avoiding it, but I would get panic attacks at Mass, and that was pretty much the only place I would get them. My junior year of college, after many drunken instances and mayhem, I met the woman who was to become my wife, and this was an answered prayer of my mother's rosaries. The rosary works, people. So after we had dated for a while, I realized I was falling for her, but I also had another love in my life, alcohol. One drunken night, while partying in a dorm with my friends, I was being unusually unruly, and the resident director was called to monitor my behavior. She showed up with 3 campus security guards. In my drunkenness, I apparently threatened to kill her dog. I was called into the dean's office the following Monday and told he was going to discuss with others, but chances were, because of my threatening behavior, I was going to be kicked out of school. They had also called my parents for a meeting on that Wednesday, and we were going to discuss my alcohol use. In sobriety, I was an affable person. As a drunk, I was violent, mean, and angry. I quickly owned up to my faults to the dean, and when my parents arrived, they agreed that I seemed repentant enough to give me another chance. I was to move out of the dorms immediately. I was to take alcohol treatment at a local facility, and if I was caught under the influence of alcohol, I was to be expelled. So I moved off campus, went to treatment sessions, and began the attempt at sobriety. It was in these darkest of days that I reached out to God and said, "God, I've dug this demonic hole that I'm in. I'm unfree as regards alcohol and sex. If I'm to get this life right and escape the hell I've created, you have to give me real heroes. I can't follow this Morrison guy anymore. Can you please help me find a real hero?" At the time, I was studying political science, and I had a keen interest in politics, mostly because of my mother intervening and teaching me the truth of the pro-life movement, not knowing at the time that politics was merely the surface of theoretical philosophy. The seeds of truth had been sown, and so I started looking for other pro-life writings to further investigate. I happened to pick up Ronald Reagan's autobiography at a used book sale, read through it, and fell in love with the guy. Here was a guy who saved our economy, but more importantly, took on the atheist regime of communism with Christian principles and won without a shot being fired. He quickly became my hero, but he was only a stepping stone. I started reading conservative commentators, some more intellectual than others. I read David Horowitz's books, who was a former communist turned conservative, Whittaker Chambers' Witness, Hayek's Road to Serfdom, The Wealth of Nations, and other anti-communist, pro-capitalist tracts. I became a vehement enemy of communism and started looking for other anti-communists. One name kept coming up in both circles where I was seeking truth, both the political anti-communism and the moral anti-abortion, and that name was Pope John Paul II. It was about this time that I had thought about becoming a professor for the first time. In the clarity of sobriety, I thought rock stardom might be a bad idea, and the idea of academia appealed to me. I was able to stay sober my entire senior year of college, and my relationship with Laura was blossoming into full-blown love. When I graduated, Laura was a sophomore in college and transferring to the University of Minnesota to get her degree in architecture. So we moved to the Twin Cities, and I proceeded to work for the state senate while Laura finished her degree. The idea of a professorship was blooming in my mind and just seemed as a right fit, as it fit my personality perfectly. My wicked past and apathetic approach to academics, however, stood in the way. I had trouble getting accepted at schools for political science, so I applied to the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul for a Catholic Studies degree. I had begun reading theology and thought I could use a Catholic Studies degree to springboard my GPA and land a good doctoral program. UST Catholic Studies reintroduced me to the intellectual heritage of the Catholic Church. It showed me what adoration was, taught me the Rosary, which I began to pray every day. The Rosary, the sword of the Spirit, began to purify my thoughts, sharpen my conscience, and ultimately led me back to confession. St. Thomas also introduced me to my newest hero, which was St. Thomas Aquinas. The twin intellectual towers of St. Thomas and John Paul II brought about a full reversion in me, along with the Rosary and the sacraments. Thomas took me a while to understand, but once I grasped him, I could not get enough of his writings. Of course, finding and knowing the truth is not the same thing as living the truth. Thomas hit the philosophical desire in my life. I was still struggling with drunkenness and pornography, albeit now with the clarity that is the light of Christ. I now knew they were sins, and with that knowledge, I knew I had the weapons to resist if I so chose. The Rosary, adoration, frequent confession. Every time I drank, I would go to confession. Every time I viewed pornography, I would go to confession. I prayed that Mary would help me fight. I had one last experience where I embarrassed my wife with my drinking, and that was it. Mary and Jesus started to make me feel guiltier about drinking than the pleasure I got out of it. I actually ended up despising drinking, and people say that Catholic guilt is a bad thing. Not necessarily always the case. Similarly with pornography, when I finally called it quits on that, God placed a horrific image in my mind. The image was compulsive and I could not shake it. It was of people molesting the Virgin Mother and Jesus Christ in a sexual way. It was clear, these women I was lusting after were Christ's. Whatever you've done unto the least of my brethren, you've done unto me. In that same era, I was able to break off the two most powerful addictions of my life. I was finally free, and God did it subtly through the grace of His confession and the Rosary. I finished my degree and decided that Thomistic philosophy was what God wanted out of me. I was accepted at the Center for Thomistic Studies at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, which actually has no affiliation to the one in St. Paul. So we packed up our things, what was now our family, as Bridget had been born the summer we moved, and we trekked to Houston. Life in Houston was one of the greatest times of my life. I didn't necessarily like the city, but I spent my days wrapped in contemplations of the mysteries of life. I was in a contemplative glow, recently freed from alcoholism and pornography, and finally thinking I had discovered my calling. Not only had I discovered it, but I was free from the damning sins I had been addicted to, and my mind was grasping truth in a way it never had before. Life was good. Because I did not have enough background in philosophy, the school decided I would need to do a year of courses to obtain my master's in philosophy before moving on to the doctorate. So I studied for 2 years in preparation for the comprehensive examination, which consisted in a 3-hour written exam, followed by a 1-hour oral exam over 12 books covering the expanse of Western philosophical history. I took the written exam, and a day later, Hurricane Ike hit Houston, knocking out power to the university for 6 days. The oral exam would have to be rescheduled. I had been told by other students that the oral exam was simply a formality and that if you passed the written, you essentially had your master's. I was intellectually exhausted, virtually memorizing 12 books in philosophy, so I decided to heed their advice and took a break. The school was unable to reschedule the exam for 3 weeks due to both disorganization in the department and the issues caused by the hurricane. Out of intellectual laziness, I didn't study at all for those 3 weeks or studied minimally. When I went to the exam, I could tell I was not prepared and was doing horribly. I ended up failing the exam. I took the exam again, the next time prepared, and I passed. But out of intellectual burnout and a firm lack of humility, it was a small school, so everybody knew that I had failed. I decided I had had enough and decided to move home. I can remember walking down the street crying to myself because I had just watched my dream go up in flames. The intellectual fatigue and humiliation were more than I could handle. I felt called to be a professor to teach truth to a secular culture lost in relativism. In one fell swoop, my dream had evaporated. I looked for scapegoats, mainly blaming God. In reality, I had no one to blame but myself. My laziness over the 3-week layoff was the reason for the failure, and that was when the dark night of soul began. So we packed up my young family and moved back to Dubuque and in with my parents. I would look for work from there. At this time, Laura was pregnant with our second child, John Paul. I spent the next year living with my parents. Mind you, this was 2009 in the midst of the Great Recession. I held 2 master's degrees now, but neither applicable in the pragmatic, technocratic way modern business views things. I spent the next year applying for over 300 jobs in all kinds of industries. I had not worked for the 2 years prior while earning my philosophy degree, so I couldn't collect unemployment. I interviewed for driving positions, editorships, jobs at the Archdiocese, jobs at Loras College. I set up visits with library staffs just to see if I could land a librarian job. I knocked on doors, I went to publishers, handed out resumes all over town. The whole time I was saying novenas to St. Joseph and St. Paul, praying my rosary, to no avail. I would go to adoration and beg for answers. Nothing would come. I would pray my rosary. No jobs would materialize. I would plead with God to help me to provide for my family, and He did not answer. Every prayer went unanswered. I found myself getting angry when I would listen to spiritual speakers talk about how good God had been to them and how He answers prayers. All I ever heard was the sound of silence. It was as if God had packed up and walked away. I was finally able to find temporary work with FedEx and eventually was able to go to work at my uncle's shop as an in-town runner. This stable work allowed us to purchase a home and move out of my parents' house. God bless my parents because without them we literally would have been in the streets. While we were able to buy a house, we had little left over for anything else. There were many days where I would deliberate about what bills to pay. If a car broke down,